Good afternoon. Welcome to the Richmond Library and Book Sandwich Inn. Excuse me. This is our fourth and final program for the fall series. Every week during September we had this program. Today's reviewer is Jason Smith. I'm sure many of you know him or know of him. This is the fourth time, I believe, that Jason has presented a book review for us for Book Sandwich Inn, and we appreciate that, and we know his time is valuable. He's a native and resident of Batavia, a 1990 graduate of Batavia High School. He's long associated with the library, his first job having been as a page, right here. He attended Geneseo and Rockport colleges, from which he obtained a BA in history from Geneseo and a master's in education and education administration from Rockport. His career includes having taught U.S. history at Albion before entering administration as vice principal. He then was principal at Alba Schools, became superintendent at Lindenville, and is now superintendent for the Batavia school system. Together, 28 years as an educator and administrator. Personally, I've known Jason and his parents, who are here today, for many years, with them living as next door neighbors. I watched him and his siblings grow from toddlers, teenagers, and now adults with their own families. He is a man of many interests, not the least of which is reading, and history remains a strong interest. He is a member and general manager of the Batavia Concert Band. At Resurrection Parish, he is a faith formation director and catechist. His hobbies include running, bird watching, movies, and he is also a Buffalo Bills fan, which I think is required in this area. He is married to his wife Lori for 23 years, and together they have 3 children, Megan, Matthew, and Madeline. And they also have family dogs, Cooper and Carol. Jason will be reviewing His Truth is Marching On by John Meacham. Please welcome Jason Smith.
The whole thing, yeah. Yep. There you go.
Thank you, Fran, for those comments, and welcome to Book Sandwich Inn. This is my, as Fran said, my 4th presentation doing this. I'm really honored to be back. And I want to welcome, watching online, our several students at Batavia High School. Mr. Stevens' class, so they're there watching. Just want to say hi to them. They're joining us since this is a book on English history. So my first love always has been history. Even though I'm a superintendent, history still remains my passion. I was really honored to have been asked to read this book. One, I had it on my shelf for a long time. But then 2, John Meacham, the author, is one of my favorite authors. I'll talk more about him in a minute. I had 2 challenges in doing this book. The first challenge was there are so many good passages I wanted to share with you. I have them all marked up, so I'm not sure if I can get them all. There's lots of good. John Meacham is a fantastic writer, and John Lewis is an even better speaker. The second challenge I had is this book is an autographed book by John Meacham. So normally when I do these talks, I like to go through and highlight and mark up the book. Because it was an autographed book, I did not want to mark up the autographed book. So I had to do the old-fashioned way and take notes in a little journal. Let's first talk about John Lewis. So John Meacham is a nationally known historian, commentator. He's been on lots of TV programs and shows. He talks in here about why he picked John Lewis. And as you see in the book, there is a religious piece to this as well. And John Meacham, in the video clip I'm going to show you, compares John Lewis to a saint. And the name of the book, and we're going to talk more about the name of the book in a minute, His Truth is Marching On. There's a famous song that is known for. So let me show you a little clip here on Meacham talking about why he picked John Lewis.
Persistent, enveloping charisma. And then he gave And so I was standing there listening to him. And as you know, he was the most unassuming man in the world, except he had this kind of quiet, persistent, enveloping charisma. And then when you gave him a microphone, he wasn't quiet anymore. And he had that remarkably preacherly voice. He had lived in Pike County in the 1940s, preached his first sermon when he was 16. Dr. King used to call him the boy from Troy because there had been a Montgomery Advertiser headline. They called him the boy preacher from Troy. They had done a feature on young John Lewis because he was so young when he was preaching in Pike County. And he starts preaching the gospel that we all know, that you march with your feet, you keep moving, you act, you keep your eye on the prize. And I was standing there, and I'm a white male, Southern, boringly heterosexual Episcopalian. You know, things work out for me in this country. But I was standing there thinking, there are millions of us who profess an allegiance to the gospel. And yet we fail so miserably at closing the gap between profession and practice. And here was a man who had closed that gap as cleanly and fully as anyone I've ever encountered in the course of American history. And I wanted to tell that story once more. I'm not saying that I'm presenting massive new information about this, but sometimes it's the old stories that we need to hear the most.
Yes.
And the John Lewis story, at any point, which is, as St. Augustine said, ever ancient, ever new, is that if you and I, if all of us can get our dispositions of heart and mind in the right place, that will find expression in the Republic. And we could move toward what Jesus thought of as the kingdom of God, what Dr. King and John called the beloved community.
Just as an aside, Fran mentioned my back I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. We do have students watching at school, and it is sports jersey week this week. It's homecoming at the school, so I do have my tie on. I want to make sure the students can see that. So as you can see, John Lewis speaks about, or John Meacham speaks about John Lewis almost as a saint-like person. He talks about the gospel, and as we walk through this, you'll see more pieces of that as to the premise behind John Meacham's argument. This is not really a biography of John Lewis. It starts with him in his early life in Alabama, and it pretty much ends in the 60s. The last part is written by John Lewis himself as an epilogue. But I just want to show you one more piece on John Meacham, his books that he has, and I just can't recommend him enough as an author. Here's his Amazon page. I've read most of his books. There's one coming out on Abraham Lincoln in October. I have The Soul of America. I haven't read that one yet, but my most favorite one that I can't recommend enough is the one on George H.W. Bush, Destiny and Power. I'm going to talk more about George Bush in a minute, how it ties into this, but it really is a great biography of President George Bush. There's one here that he wrote about Jesus' last word on the cross, and he just writes in a very easy way to understand without also not talking down to his audience either. You know, he's a great author, so just would recommend him. I can't recommend him enough. So let's start and talk about his hands. So early in the book, on page 23, John Lewis is born in the state of Alabama. By the way, he also becomes known in the state of Tennessee, which is where I bought the book from. I bought the book from an independent bookstore in Tennessee called Parnassus Books. They sell autographed book copies. So the book did come from Nashville, Tennessee, where John Lewis really made his name known. So these are a picture of just some hands. I just want to read you a passage of what John Lewis says about hands and how these hands served as his motivation for the rest of his life. The hands that I'm referring to are his mom's hands. All right, and these are John Meacham's words here, what he says about the hands. John Lewis always remembered those hands, particularly his mom's fingers. Fingers split and hardened by years in the cotton fields. Her son honored her endurance, even marveled in it. Yet he also recoiled from a way of life that put struggling people out under the southern sun, hunched over and compelled, season after season, decade after decade, to eke out a living while fingers bled and muscles ached. And these are Lewis's words now. Working for nothing. That's what I would tell my mother we were doing, Lewis said in 1998. I know what upset her and my father. I carried my load, I did my duties, but I also spoke my mind. And even today, my mother shakes her head at what an irritating habit that was. And I heard John Meacham talk about that as well, how John Lewis, when he got behind the microphone, he was a different man. So now we're going to go from the hands to the end of the book. In March of 2020, just before COVID hit, it was on March 13th. This took place on March 5th, I think. John Lewis was at Selma, speaking once again. We're talking about what happened in Selma later on, but this is, so I showed you the hands where everything started, and then his life really came full circle in March of 2020 when he spoke at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where the famous Bloody Sunday March took place. I'm going to show you him. I'm going to show you a video clip of him speaking there as well at Alabama on the 35th anniversary of that. So this is from CNN. John Lewis returns to Selma, and I'm just going to show you a couple seconds of it.
5 years ago, a few of God's children attempted to march from Brown Chapel Area Church across this bridge. We were beaten, we were tear gas. I thought I was going to down this bridge. But somehow and some way, God Almighty helped me. We cannot give up now. We cannot give in. We must keep the faith, keep our eyes on the prize. We must go out and vote like we never, ever voted before. Some people gave more than a little blood. Some gave...
So you heard him talk about keep his eyes on the prize. You heard John Meacham mention that as well. You also heard John Lewis talk about the importance of going out to vote. So this next picture here I like for lots of reasons. One, it speaks about John Lewis and his passion to have strong voting rights, but two, you can see who's up there. Not only is he standing next to Barack Obama, he's also standing next to George Bush, whose inauguration John Lewis did not go to because he believed that he had issues with the election of 2000. John Lewis did not go to that. Did not go to his inauguration. There they are standing on a bridge holding hands. As we get through the story, you're going to learn more about John Lewis's incredible ability to forgive. What's also ironic, too, is that both George Bush and John Lewis in 2006, they worked as a team to establish the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. So John Lewis did not go to George W. Bush's inauguration in the year 2000, because you know what happened in the year 2000. He believed that there were voting rights issues there, but still they worked hand in hand, they put the differences aside. So that's just a powerful image. And it also speaks about John Lewis's strong desire to forgive. As I said, John Meacham, the author, compares John Lewis to a saint. A saint, as you know, is somebody who is willing to suffer and die for others. In the book, a historian by the name of Marty says a saint has to be a misfit. A saint has to be a misfit. And John Lewis himself was arrested 45 times. 45 times he was arrested. He was fragged, his skull was damaged, and he was beaten. So I just want to read to you, this are John Lewis's words that speak to Meacham's argument that John Lewis is, could be considered a saint. But once I make a decision, I stay the course. He also said that in the clip we saw. I was that way when I was 8, and I'm that way now. I'm not without passion. In fact, I have a very strong sense of passion. But my passion plays itself out in a deeper, patient way. This is the same part coming up. When I care about something, when I commit to it, I'm prepared to take the long, hard road, knowing that it may not happen today or tomorrow, but ultimately, eventually, it will happen. You know, think of the saints that maybe, the challenges that they have faced. So that's Meacham's argument that John Lewis could be considered a saint. The other thing you'll see, this is some of the Bible passages that I have found, there's a strong correlation between faith and works. And throughout the book, John Meacham makes the argument that even though John Lewis was a man of strong faith, he also believed in doing something with the faith, right? It's fine just to have faith, but you also have to do something with the faith. These Bible passages that are up here speak to that. And later on, we'll see more evidence of John Lewis taking his faith that he has and then applying it to different positive works. In James chapter 2:24, we see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. We hear that all the time. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. So John Lewis just didn't just preach to the heavens. He was very practical in his approach as well. Of course, we recognize these, perhaps the Beatitudes. John Lewis takes his inspiration from lines 3 and 4. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So John Lewis has hung on to those at times as well. Sometimes we know this as a social gospel. One of my favorite quotes from St. Francis, it's short and sweet, and I used it before. Preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. That really speaks to this concept of faith and works. All right, Simon Peter, of course, if you know your Bible history, Peter was originally named Simon. Jesus changed his name to become Peter. John Lewis was actually, his full name was Robert John Lewis. Right? We know him now as John Lewis. And John Lewis became known as John Lewis once he became more public in his works. The point that Meacham makes here is that just as Jesus renamed Simon Peter, Peter became more public in his works, Robert John Lewis dropped his name and just became John Lewis. So another evidence there that Meacham cites of John Lewis's idea of being a saint. So of course there's Simon Peter there. Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. Jesus has changed his name. John Lewis, his family knew him as Robert until he became more public, just as the saints became more public as they did their work. So I like this one. I like animals. You heard I had a couple dogs. John Lewis got his start by preaching to chickens when he was a kid. And he learned the art of self-giving love among chickens. So there's also there's a strong analogy between him talking with the chicken and what he did later on in life. I'm going to read to you first what John Lewis himself says about the chickens, and then what John Meacham's conclusion on those chickens. All right, so this is John Lewis talking about preaching to the chickens. I don't think there's any way to estimate how much that experience of tending to those nesting hens taught me about discipline and responsibility and patience. It was not a struggle at all. It was something I wanted to do. The kinship I felt with these living creatures, the compassion, is a feeling I carried with me out into the world from that point on. And then John Meacham says this. This is John Meacham, the author, saying this. And for good reason, it's very charming. The serious young farm boy presiding over an unruly flock of chickens, attentive to detail, concern for the well-being of others, and insistently offering the gospel to an audience disinclined to heed it. The chickens are only the real folk, disinclined to heed it. Lewis himself saw his work in the coop as formative. He learned the art of agape, of self-giving love among those chickens, and he learned the more difficult the task, the better he liked it. Anybody recognize this city? Buffalo. Right? So I wanted to show up, when Lewis turned 11 years old, he came up here. And his eyes were open. This is moving. He's only 11 years old, still known as Robert John Lewis at that point. When Lewis came to Buffalo in 1951, he was shocked that the blacks and whites lived together and shopped together. He had never seen that before. And his exact comment was, it was another world. That was probably a turning point for him. He then went on to a biblical school or Bible school in Nashville. But really, the prominent piece here, he went to this school called a Highlander Folk School. I don't know if it's still around or not, but that's a picture of it as it looked. There's a historical marker of it there. The Highlander Folk School was founded in 1932. Its intention was to train labor leaders to how to create effective change. Again, this goes back to the faith and works. John Lewis wanted to take his faith and then apply it into works. So I want to read to you what he learned at this school. So faith and works, this is what John Lewis learned. He's speaking about one of his instructors. He learned many things, but this is really the most powerful. He, the instructor, showed us how to curl our bodies so that our internal organs would escape direct hits. It was not enough, he would say, simply to endure a beating. It was not enough to resist the urge to strike back at an assailant. The urge can't be there. You have to do more than not just hit back. You have to have no desire to you have to have no desire to hit back. You have to love that person who is hitting you. And you'll see in a minute what happened to him. So that's one of the lessons you learn at the Highlander Folk School. Just again, if you take what Meacham's argument is about sainthood and self-giving love and forgiveness, he learned that at the Highlander Folk School. These people were very influential. Mahatma Gandhi on the left and Jesus on the right. Also Martin Luther King plays a very important part in it as well. Those were really the three key figures. Of course, Martin Luther was a contemporary of John Lewis. Gandhi and Jesus, of course, were not. But he did take his teachings from them. And this is what Lewis comments on the teachings of some of these men. He says, hate is too heavy of a burden to bear. If you start hating people, you have to decide who are you going to hate tomorrow. Who are you going to hate next week? Just love everybody. And on one occasion I heard Dr. King say, just love the hell out of everybody. It's better that way. It's the best way. Of course, these are the same teachings that we have from these gentlemen up here. And of course, Gandhi, you know the story of Gandhi, he suffered himself many beatings as well in trying to free India. Or Harvey's department store in Nashville, I know this is before my time, but in the 60s, Harvey's department store, it was a site of some of the first sit-ins that John Lewis began to lead. All right, again, this is taking place in Nashville. So these are a photograph of course, the whites could not sit at the black counter, or at the countertops. The blacks could not sit at the countertops with the whites. They did so anyway. You all know what happened, right? So I'm just going to read to you what John Meacham says about that, how badly they were beat. And again, think back to what he said at the Highlander School about how he had to endure those different beatings, all right? After that, he is then put into a paddy wagon. This is what he says about being in the paddy wagon. That paddy wagon, crowded, cramped, dirty, with wire casing windows and doors, seemed like a chariot to me. So he's in a paddy wagon, but yet he calls it a chariot. A freedom vehicle carrying me across the threshold. I wondered all along, as anyone would, how I would handle the reality of what I had studied and trained and thought about for so long. Here's the spiritual part. Now I knew. Now I had crossed over. I had stepped through the door in total unquestioning promise. This wasn't just about the moment or that day. This was about forever. I had, as they say in Christian circles, when a person accepts Jesus Christ into his heart, come home. This was not the Jesus I had come home to. It was a purity and utter certainty of the nonviolent path. So after he was arrested and beaten for being at these counters, that's how he reflects on the paddy wagon, but he calls it a chariot. Another biblical message that John Meacham writes about, of course, when Jesus is crucified on the cross, his famous words were, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Again, you see those strong connections in John Lewis's life as well. Even going as far as holding hands with the president he did not come to his inauguration in 2000. John Lewis, he almost dies again. This time he's in a restaurant in Nashville, and the owner of the restaurant starts to put insecticide in the restaurant, and he's locked in. And John Lewis says, him and one of his friends, we were both coughing, gasping for air, we were going to suffocate, I thought we were going to die. He said he thought he was going to die on the Selma Bridge too. So again, you think about the saint that Meacham keeps talking about. And I was not familiar with the story. This happened on November 10th, 1960. The owner put insecticide in there. The firemen did come, and they weren't quite sure how they would respond. Would they let John Lewis out? You know, they weren't sure about that. There's another story I've shared with you in a minute about how the authorities may respond to some of these issues. All right, so then we have the famous freedom rides in the 1960s when the court declares that segregated buses are unconstitutional. It's fine that they said that. That's not what happened. So John Lewis again is going to go there and have more protests and ride those buses. What I found really interesting about this, there was a gentleman, a white gentleman, who was a member of the KKK, and this story takes place in Rock Hill, which is in Alabama. And this gentleman's name is Elwyn Wilson. And again, I'm going to go to the theme here of forgiveness. Elwyn Wilson was one of those men that beat John Lewis almost to a pulp. This is what John Lewis says. I was once not John Lewis, Elwyn Wilson. I was once the meanest man that ever was in Rock Hill. He threw cantaloupes and watermelons at blacks and beat up blacks who dared to be seen anywhere where he was. And then Wilson says, I've done some bad things. I thought it was cool. I hated blacks. I hated them. 2009, he came out and publicly disclosed his role for what he did. This was in the 60s, 2009. Elwyn Wilson's still alive. He comes out and says, these are the things I did. John Lewis met with him, and he forgave him many, many times. So, as an aside, there's a movie reference and a book reference I can share with you that I think kind of tie into this. The movie reference is called The Best of Enemies. And has anybody seen it? It wasn't too popular. I saw it a couple years ago. So Sam Rockwell and Taraji P. Henson. Sam Rockwell plays a white KKK member in the South, in North Carolina. She plays a civil rights advocate. They hate each other. By the end of the story, they became lifelong friends. They worked together to get to school. It was not easy. So they patched up the differences. The other, on the right, a book I could recommend that I read several years ago. I talked about Saint Francis. This book was recommended to me by the priest that had married us through his annual Christmas letter, who was a Franciscan himself. The book is called Left to Tell, and it's about the Holocaust in Rwanda, I think in the 90s. And it's nonfiction, and the main character of the story is nonfiction, though. Her whole family is killed as a result of the Holocaust. Long story short, she goes and tracks down those who had done that, meets them in jail, meets them in the prison, and forgives them. So again, the movie reference and a book reference that ties into that story that I just talked about. All right, so we talked about when John Lewis was trapped in that restaurant. Okay, he's also trapped in the First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, as part of the Freedom Riders. All right. Outside of this church, there were white crowds growing in numbers, yelling. They had the Confederate flags, throwing Molotov cocktails. Byron White, who later on became the Supreme Court Justice, worked at that time for President John Kennedy. He was concerned. They had called in the federal marshals, and Byron White, who became the Supreme Court Justice at the time, was an aide to John Kennedy, was not convinced how the federal marshals would respond and who they would respond with. Would they help out the folks in the church, or would they stand by and let the crowd outside do their thing? They ultimately did the right thing, right? But Byron White was not convinced that that was going to happen. The reason why I had that song up there, one that's His Troops Are Marching On is a lyric in that song, the battle hymn. But they sang that song as they're in the church waiting to what's going to happen. John Lewis and his colleagues sang that song. So just after that, Lewis is taken to Parchman prison. He really has an epiphany here at this moment. This was a strong moment in his life. He had plans to go to India. Up until that point, he was going to work with the American Friends Service Committee and go to India and do some mission work over there. He's in this Parchman Farm, and it was a horrible place. Basically says they were treated like animals. They waited naked for an hour and a half. On one occasion, a fire hose was brought in, and we were blasted with jets of water. Giant fans were then set up and turned on full blast, freezing us in our cells. Especially on hot days, and there are many of these in the summer in Mississippi, the windows were kept shut and we were baked in the airless heat. Signal lights were kept on and around, making it difficult to sleep. So John Meacham says this: as a result of this, again, think about faith and works. John Lewis made the decision to stay here in the U.S. and do his work and not go to India. In Parchman, Lewis came to a decision. His place was here on the battlefield of his homeland, not in India. He wrote the American Friends Service to withdraw from the overseas corps in which he had just been accepted. Then John Lewis says this: the people who were together at Parchman, we grew up in that time too. We grew up in that time there. We grew tougher and we grew wiser. We did a lot of teaching and praying and singing there. We became better souls and more committed to the way of peace and the way of love. So again, faith and works, what John Lewis wanted to do back home. I'm going to stop for a minute and let you read that. All right. We got to quit. We got to start treating them right. They just like everybody else. All right. The same person that said that, just after World War II, said this. And they went, guess what, maybe George Wallace. All right, so he says this after World War II. All right, he says this in 1963, and it's George Wallace. John Meacham's point in that story is that people of course will say things just to get elected, right? So he was not born this way. I just kind of threw that it had nothing really to do with John Lewis himself, but just as an aside, Meacham makes that point over and over again. He said the same thing years later. And then, of course, we have Atticus Finch. That's Gregor Peck from the movie. He, of course, is a hero in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I got to add, who's the author of it? Is it Harper Lee? Yeah, Harper Lee. It's right. Harper Lee. She writes a second story called Go Set a Watchman. Atticus Finch is the main character in that story. He's not portrayed the same way he is in To Kill a Mockingbird. He's portrayed as a classic white Southerner using the battle cry states' rights to keep things just the way they are. So he is preserved as a Southern white man, and Atticus says, not in To Kill a Mockingbird, but into Go Set a Watchman, that no Supreme Court is going to tell us what to do. So even you have the actual historical figure here of George Wallace, who was changed from this to this. Then you have Atticus Finch, fictional character. Harper Lee also reflects that in her work as well. All right, I'm going to do this back. I'm going to read to you something from this book. This was written in the 60s. And this was given to John Lewis to read when he was at Parchman. I'm just going to read to you what the author of this book said before I tell you who it was. The whole matter can be really put into a nutshell. A gullible, trusting nation has been misled by various minority groups into believing that the Negroes have an inborn capacity for Western civilization equal to the white race. Thus, it is not the South which is committing a moral crime against the Negro in maintaining segregation, but the North, which is committing a moral crime against the South and forcing integration. Those are harsh words written by an educated man, and the person that wrote those words that John Lewis read was a gentleman named by Carlton Putnam, who was a Princeton grad, and at one time the head of Delta Airlines. Just something that John Lewis read when he was there that further motivated. Okay, so we all know, again, a little bit before my time, Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington in 1963. John Lewis was there. He spoke just before Martin Luther King. I want to show you, I did not realize that he spoke prior to Martin Luther King. I'm just going to show you some of his speech here as well. I want to talk about how it was received.
I have the pleasure to present to this great audience young John Lewis, National Chairman, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Brother John Lewis.
We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. Hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here, but they're receiving starvation wages or no wages at all. While we stand here, there are sharecroppers in the Delta of Mississippi who are out in the field working for less than $3 a day, 12 hours a day. While we
Now, if you know the speech that Martin Luther King gave, is very, flowery, very dynamic. Listen to what John Lewis is saying here about his comments and how it probably differs from Martin Luther King's comments.
And here there are students in jail on trump-up charges. Our brother James Palmer, along with many others, is also in jail. We come here today with a great sense of misgiving. It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill.
Okay, so the point that Meacham makes here, and he tells a story, is that he compares Martin Luther King to the mountain. Okay, he has very lofty words, very powerful words. John Lewis speaks about the people who are suffering on the ground. There's a picture up there of a mountain and a valley. After that, John Lewis was greeted by President John F. Kennedy. And JFK, he speaks to John Lewis, and John Lewis, of course, wants to hear what's he going to say about me. Is he going to like my speech? The only words that JFK offers to John Lewis is this: "I heard you speak." That's all I said. He didn't say anything positive, like Martin. He said, "I heard you speak." He had a total blank expression on his face. Lewis actually was obscured in the different pictures there. And the quote on that, a Christian value, of course, is humility. Again, going back to the saint argument. And John Meacham writes about the concept of humility. So he's told by the president, "I heard you speak." And this is what Meacham says about his humbleness. It was true that Lewis's humility stayed intact as he rose to fame. His lack of polish, his quiet conviction, and his unassuming physical presence created a kind of charm that stood as a special grace that set him apart as a figure of note and inspiration. In the moral universe of the kingdom of God, reversal is the role. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. It's fitting then that the rough-edged John Lewis would be the means by which a smooth path should be carved to the wilderness of the world. So when I think of another historical figure that John Meacham also wrote about, I think of George Bush. Right? George Bush, when I read his story, he was taught by his mom, never brag. Never brag about yourself. Always be humble. Always be humble. So I thought, George Bush, in my opinion, was a great, great man. And John Meacham also writes about him in that light as well. There's a Bible passage in there that speaks about the power of being humble. You can read that. Therefore, as God's chosen people, wholly clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, and humility. And I'm sure John Lewis was humbled when he heard JFK say to him, "I heard you speak." I heard you speak. So then, 1963, there's the very sad 16th Street Baptist Church bombing when these 4 black girls were killed, among many more. There were 4 children killed. This really obviously upset Lewis to the core, and he's at that point, he's had enough. He still is going to stay nonviolent, but at that point, he has had enough. And he says, at one point, how much more nonviolent can we keep being? I just want to read you part from this bombing is here as well. So this happened in 1963. I looked at those black men and women of Birmingham who had lived through so much, and I knew they had to be asking themselves, how much more, what else, what's next? 4 children killed on a Sunday morning in church, in God's house, what could be next? So he's really he stays the whole course with non-violence, but he does say, Malcolm X actually says this, that the Klansmen don't go to funerals. We go to funerals, the Klansmen don't. And so Lewis is starting to come to terms with the whole non-violent piece. I'm just going to jump ahead here. He does have a falling out with Malcolm X. Okay, Malcolm X, of course, still wants to keep on keeping on with a more violent approach to it, with a more aggressive approach to it. Malcolm X says this, and this is not how Lewis is. The black man in America is the only one who was encouraged to be nonviolent. Of course, Lewis is preaching nonviolence. Never do you find white people encouraging other whites to be nonviolent. So him and Malcolm X kind of have a falling out there. He does find an ally, though, and he's quite surprised in President Johnson. President Johnson, and I read about him as well, great politician. He knew how to work in Congress. He got a lot done in Congress. The civil rights folks were concerned with, because they knew who JFK was, a white northerner. Johnson, of course, was not. He was a white southerner. They were very skeptical. Johnson turned out to be a great partner of John Lewis throughout his time. The reason why I said Johnson is a great politician, he never got too far ahead of where he was. He never got too far ahead of the different voters. He still wanted to do all things for all people, including the black population. Johnson knew if he went too far, he would never get elected, and so therefore he wouldn't be able to get anything done. And when Johnson became president, he said, now I represent the whole country, and I can do what the whole country thinks is right, or ought to do what is right. So John Lewis finds a rather interesting partner in President Johnson. Except for Vietnam. And John Lewis, he was not in favor of Vietnam for obvious reasons, in that John Lewis says this about the war in Vietnam. He received a notice from his draft board informing that his status has now been changed from 1-0 to 4-F. I was morally unfit for service, they explained, because of my long record of arrests. And then Meacham writes about this. This is the issue that Lewis had with Vietnam. The hypocrisy of an America fighting for liberty abroad while tolerating white supremacy at home informed the movement in those years. And John Lewis says this: it seemed extremely contradictory to me for President Johnson to be sending tens of thousands of troops to fight the war in Vietnam to protect the rights of the people of South Vietnam, at the same time as rights of the black people across the nation continuing to be violated without issue. So if you know President Johnson and his story, Vietnam was really the undoing for him. But John Lewis and President Johnson did have some common ground there. So the last thing I want to end with, I even read the appendix of this book, and they have lots of stats in there. There's lots of Gallup polls. So at the height of civil rights in the 60s, there were polls taken. The whole movement itself received very, very low approval ratings, especially from the white population. Decades later, they did the exact same survey. So at the time, the civil rights were happening, not popular at all. Decades later, they did the exact same survey, and they found that the of all the events that happened in the 20th century, I'm going to give you a chance to guess. Number one through 10, what would you say that when the survey was taken recently, where they placed the civil rights? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What do you think? It was ranked as the fifth most important event in all of the 20th century. Decades later, after this happened, it's ahead of World War I. It's ahead of landing on the moon. It's ahead of the assassination of JFK. It's ahead of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's ahead of the Great Depression as one of the most important events in all of U.S. history. At the time it was happening, when they did the surveys, very, very low approval rate. It was not popular at all. So it just shows you how things can change over time. So just some final thoughts, and I'm happy to take any questions. I would say, one, that John Meacham and John Lewis, the author and the subject, are very aligned as to how they view the world. They both have a very balanced, moderate approach. Meacham does start off with some very strong ties throughout the whole book to sainthood and religion. He kind of goes into the politics of it, but he does spend a lot of time looking at the spiritual side of John Lewis. This is not a full John Lewis biography. It's focused primarily on his early life. And as I said before, Meacham is a talented writer and a talented speaker. I think John Meacham, in my opinion, his finest moment, if you go back and watch it on YouTube, was when he gave the eulogy at George Bush's funeral. He tells a great story about his time with George Bush. They became personal friends, and John Meacham himself tells a great story about what happened in George Bush's final days. I want to end with a quote from John Lewis himself from the epilogue, from the last part of the story here. And again, it talks about the sainthood. This is John Lewis in the afterword. The journey begins with faith. Faith in the dignity and the worth of every human being. That is an idea with roots in Scripture and in the canon of America, in Genesis, and in the Declaration of Independence. The journey is sustained by persistence. Persistence in the pressing of the justice of the cause. The journey is informed by hope. Again, the name of the book, The Power of Hope. The journey is informed by hope. Hope that someday, in some way, our restless souls will bring heaven and earth together, and God will wipe away every tear. So that's my comment. So happy to take any questions.
I was just wondering how an 11-year-old boy from Alabama happened to come to Buffalo.
His uncle took him. It was just a trip.
Oh.
He wanted his uncle. Yeah. I'm not sure. I think it may have been for his birthday.
Oh. Okay.
The story was uncle.
Any other questions for Jason? Comments? Oh, Christina?
It's just a comment, it's not a question. If you're looking to also read other books about John Lewis, the March trilogy is a graphic memoir trilogy about John Lewis's life. It's his words, but they're drawn out like pictures and everything, like a comic book, but it's really accessible for younger students. So that's a good one to read.
Any questions from our students who are watching? Anything, Sam?
Nothing coming through.
Yes.
I think there was an article, this was a while ago, in the Buffalo paper that he came to Buffalo to live with some relative for a while. So I don't know if it was the summer.
It may have been that same trip.
Yeah,
talking about
right,
that.
yeah, but, yeah.
Bart?
I've been watching a documentary on Tesla and how he's almost been erased from history. Martin Luther King has a lot of obvious tributes. Are they working on anything with John Lewis right now to get his name elevated to the status that maybe it should be?
Not that I've heard. There's nothing in here in this book that had talked about that. I have not heard that. I'm looking for something on Buffalo. No, I have not heard that part. No.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Jason.